Hey Gear Seekers, I'm Nick. This case is something that you guys have been asking us to check out. We managed to get our hands on one a few weeks ago. It's the SSUPD or Sunny Side Up. I think that's how it's meant to be pronounced. The Meshlicious. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna build, we're gonna test the thermals, we're gonna pull it apart and see what makes this thing tick, and then we're gonna tell you if this thing is any good. Yeah, I don't know what happened to my voice at the end, but yeah. Anyway. Before we pull this apart and see what makes it tick, I just want to address a few things that we're going to see in the comments. The first thing is it's going to be like, oh, this case is copying another case made by another company. There's a pretty simple explanation for what you're seeing with this case. The company, I'm sorry, I'm just going to call it the Meshlicious. The company that makes the Meshlicious is a collaboration between Lian-Li and Ncase. So you're seeing a lot of design cues from both of those cases and companies that you're used to. So without further ado, let's pull it apart and see what makes the Meshlicious tick. Wow, I actually pronounced it right at the last time. Panel removal on the Meshlicious is pretty straightforward. So what I've done is I've just rotated the case around so you guys can see, but essentially it's got a similar clipping system like the Cooler Master NR200, whereas you just push it and the panels pop off quite easily. I like this mounting system. You can see the pins on each corner. Yeah, so that's basically how it all holds together. On the GPU side, we're gonna call it that, but it's, you know, you can move these panels around, which I'm gonna show in a sec, but it's a tempered glass panel and it's the same again. It literally just pops off with the same mechanism. Now, to address the questions we're going to get, can you put the panels on opposite sides if you wanted to optimize for GPU airflow? The answer is yes. Yes, you can. So you can put these panels on either side. What would be nice is if they included a secondary mesh panel, so you could do the whole thing mesh, but I don't know if the non-riser cable version, well, this is the premium version with the PCIe Gen 4 riser cable, which I'm going to chat about in a minute, but yeah, it would be nice to have an additional side panel for that kind of stuff. Front panel and top panel, again, is exactly the same. It's just those little push pins and the top pops off as well. And what we're left with is the whole frame of the Meshlicious. It's a pretty open frame, as you can see here, and quite an elegant sandwich design. So you've got the motherboard mounting side here, you've got this other side for the GPU, which can be mounted on the opposite side. And this one in particular, the version that got sent through, has the PCIe Gen 4 riser cable. So for the premium edition, the one that's going for $179, you can actually get it to work with PCIe Gen 4. In terms of included accessories, you have a hard drive mounting bracket that can be mounted to the bottom of the case if you weren't using the GPU in the sandwich layout like we're going to be using. There's also an HDMI cable with a right angle connector on one side. There's also some additional mounting gear to allow you to change how deep the motherboard and GPU side of the case is, which is probably something that we'll be doing when we build with it, considering we're going to use a pretty thick GPU, and for thick GPUs you will need to use this. Obviously all the normal stuff, you got screws and whatnot. This is all just standard case stuff. And a collection of tweezers, obviously. Lots and lots of tweezers, zip ties. Now, Bindy's actually indicating where you would mount the radiator on this case. So you can do a 280mm or a 240mm. With the bracket that's currently installed here is for 240mm. We're going to be removing this because we are going to do 280 in this build. And thanks for pointing that out, Bindy. I really, really appreciate you using your tail to help us figure out where stuff's supposed to go in this case. What do you reckon, sweetheart? You're just gonna be like that, are you? You don't want to chat to the people? She's currently got a cone on her head because she's been desexed, and she's just, she won't leave me alone. But I love it. Aren't you just the cutest thing? Right, so we're not going to use this bracket for the build, which is okay. Well, there's 2 brackets rather, but yes. They can be removed. There's just 3 screws holding them in on each side. For the front panel connections, we've got the power LED. She's moving the screwdriver with her tail. For front panel connectivity, we've got the power switch, the power light, and the hard disk activity light. There's a USB Type-C front panel connector, as well as a connector for USB 3.0 as well. While we're on the topic of front panel, there is the USB Type-C port, the power button, and also the USB Type-A port for the front as well. The power supply support actually allows you to install an ATX power supply, which is actually quite nice for a small case like this, considering ATX power supplies are a bit cheaper, as well as SFX and SFXL via this bracket here. So if you remove these 4 screws here, it actually allows you to install an ATX power supply. We're not going to be doing that in this video. We're going to be using an SFX just to save on space and whatnot, but it is a nice little option that you can actually change this via a bracket. So good work. In terms of GPU support, you've got 2 mounting options. You can either mount a short ITX style GPU, so like the shorter ones, across here, right, if that's what you wanted to do, or in the way that we're going to do it in the full sandwich design, is mount it like this. So for GPU length, I'm going to say, to be safe, I would probably say around 315 millimeters maximum. Cards like the Gaming X Trio cards, the new 30 series cards, probably will not fit in this case, so don't even go there essentially. And this one is a 286 millimeter. This is the 6900 XT Gaming OC from Gigabyte. This is the card we're actually going to be using in the build. So I would say that if you're using a card with a really tall cooler like this, which we're going to show when we build, is you can actually change the offset of this to allow for thicker GPUs. Now, the reason why I say this is because the side panel that typically goes on this side is glass. So you will want to move it away from the glass, well, as far away as possible. You can use the mesh side on this side and then use the glass on the other side if you like. We're going to be setting this up in a negative pressure setup where it's going to be pulling air through the side panels and pushing the hot air out the front to optimize for cooling both the CPU and GPU. Because we're going to be changing the offset, I'm going to change it now to show you how to do it. So what you'll need to do is completely remove this bracket first. I would recommend doing it in this order, mind you. We're then going to remove this bracket here. This is where the IO cutout is. You see, you can actually offset that. So what we're going to do is we're going to move that now. The next step is to then remove these screws for this bar at the top of the case, right? And this is the support for the motherboard tray. So the one that it ships with is this long, and the one we're replacing it with is that long. So you can see the difference in the offsets here. So we're going to use the shorter one. The next step is to then remove this screw, and the screw at the top. Lastly, there's one more screw at the bottom that we need to move. All we need to do is then slide it over to the hole that's slightly next to that hole that we just removed it from, and screw that back in. And then the next step is just to put all those screws back that we removed, and then the offset is now done. Now that it's all put together and I've changed the offset, now you'll be able to see things like where it pushes it out more towards that side of the case, and also the power supply bracket also moves the other way as well, and it has these little notches and cutouts here as well, which allows the tray to have a little bit of extra support too. So yeah, is quite an elegant way of mixing it up if that's what you wanted to do. Now, I would actually recommend doing that, considering the way that GPUs are going, being a lot thicker. That being said, up to 4 slots of GPU, as I mentioned already, but only if you change that offset. In terms of air cooling support, if you wanted to go down that path, if you didn't change the offset, you're not going to have a lot of clearance. So tower coolers are a no-go. You will need to use a flat type of air cooler. So anything like the Intel stock coolers or AMD stock coolers, most of those should fit in here, no problem whatsoever. But be aware of the offset as well. And if that's the case, then you can set it up in a positive pressure setup where you're pulling air in from the front as well. But like I mentioned, because we're using an AIO, I would recommend negative pressure. So pulling in from the side panel and venting out through the front. That's going to be the best way for CPU and GPU thermals in this case. Well, that's basically everything that I thought I would mention about this case before building. Obviously, I'm going to come back and we're going to have a proper chat about how it is to build and everything towards the end of the video and all the thermals. But with that said, let's start building. Let's get right into it. ladies and gents, I hope you enjoyed the build in the Meshlicious. All right, let's take a look at the thermals, and what you're seeing on the screen now is the thermals are absolutely fantastic. This case has some of the best thermals for a small form factor case that I've ever seen, and it is truly a testament to this design. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I do recommend that you do use a negative pressure setup if you're going to be building the way that we did. I did test in the positive pressure mode, in it being a bit hotter, obviously because you're pushing all that hot air inside of the case and you're warming up all the components. That in a normal desktop case isn't usually a problem because any airflow is good airflow in those situations, but for this one in particular, because the space is so tight, negative pressure. Blow all the hot air out the front. There's enough vents and holes around the edge of the case for it to actually be able to pull the air in. So yeah, that's why I recommend that. Even with the glass side panel side, if you do the offset, like I mentioned earlier in the video, yeah, the negative pressure setup works because at the back of the case, it's basically completely open. So you're pulling air in a straight line from the back through to the front, and the GPU is getting enough airflow because it's not sitting up against the glass. So very, very impressive thermally. And I'm really liking this case. But before we talk about all that, let's quickly chat about the parts. The CPU that I went for was one that I chose on purpose to be hot. It's the Intel Core i9-10900K. It's usually a pretty warm CPU, and a 280mm cooler is a nice match for it. The motherboard is the Asus ROG STRIX Z490i Gaming, I think that's what it's called. This is the one that we actually sent away to get RMA'd because the voltage regulator on the back exploded a while ago from one of the last small form factor builds that we did, and we had to swap the board out, but it's back and it's working, and it's, yeah, it does the trick. Now, one thing to note with this motherboard in particular, and other motherboards that are kind of designed this way for ITX, is if you're using an all-in-one liquid cooler, we had to remove the heatsink from the M.2 drive, which for this Gen 3 drive, not a big deal at all, but just be aware that if you're using a Gen 4 drive that requires cooling, you will need to take into account what motherboard you're choosing for this case if you're doing a liquid cooling setup like this one. To cool the 10900K, we went with the NZXT Kraken X63 RGB. It's like the revised version with RGB fans. I only went with the RGB version basically so there was a little bit of lighting for the B-roll. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have had any lighting in this whatsoever. The RAM is 16 gigs of Thermaltake Z1 at 3200 megahertz from memory. Pretty decent RAM. I don't mind it. It's quite low profile for RGB memory, which is why I went with it as well. You do need to take into account the height of your memory if you are changing the offset of this case, because even the cooler, the top of the pump top, is getting pretty close to that side panel. For the power supply, we went with the Cooler Master V850 SFX power supply. We basically use this as our go-to power supply for all small form factor builds because it's 850 watts, and for GPUs like the one that we picked for this, it's absolutely perfectly matched. Speaking of, it's the Gigabyte Radeon RX 6900 XT. This is the first time we've used this GPU for anything on the channel. We will be reviewing it shortly, but yeah, I'm just a bit kind of not keen to do that because everyone keeps complaining about GPU availability and there's nothing we can do. We just get them sent to us and, you know, they're like, hey, review this. We're like, okay. Like, if something arrives, I'm gonna do a video about it, let's be honest. And lastly, the case. The SSUPD, or Sunny Side Up, I think that's how you say it, the Meshlicious. And people are gonna get upset about my joking throughout the video. It's just a joke, guys, chill. Okay, right. Now, this case, for a small form factor case, is a joy to build in. It's very, very easy to build in, but there are a few things to note. The first thing to note is, again, like I mentioned with the all-in-one liquid cooler, you need to be wary of the motherboard that you're going to use, so make sure you do a little bit of research before you jump on in and use a liquid cooler. The second thing is you can go tubes down. This case is actually designed to go this way, so I would recommend going tubes down. There's plenty of room in here to do this. Basically, you can either tuck the tubes behind the power supply cables or around the back like we did, and it works no problem. Again, for liquid cooling setups, I would recommend negative pressure if you're doing a build like this. There are other use cases and applications where you can do positive pressure if you're doing an air cooler and stuff. But for this, from what we found with thermal testing, we did thermal test with positive pressure. Yeah, that's just what we decided to do. And we found that to be the best application for this case in particular. It's weird, yeah, I know, but it works really, really well. Also note, with the power supply, you'll notice that we have the fan facing out. That is by design on purpose because we're using the mesh side panel on this side, and there's not a lot of space for it to breathe and pull in air if the fan spins up at all. The only thing I would have done differently with this build is the cable management, only because I don't have like nice thin custom cables for this power supply. However, if you're a small form factor enthusiast who likes nice clean builds, I suspect you will be going down that route. So I would actually recommend some of those thin custom sleeve cables that you can get from Cable Mod for any power supplies you use. Basically, they're just a thinner gauge wire, they're easy to bunch up, and you can whack them anywhere and tie them down anywhere. Also, if you're doing a negative pressure setup in this case, you have to take into account where you're going to cable manage, otherwise your cables are going to hit the fans. Now, you can do negative pressure in the way that the fans are on the other side of the radiator. However, you're making it more difficult for yourself for tube routing because you're pushing the tubes out. So I would still recommend doing it the way that we did it here. Another thing to really note with this case is you do need a right angle HDMI or DisplayPort cable to use this. Now, I tested to see if we could fit a regular DisplayPort cable and bend it. No dice, don't do that, you're gonna destroy your cable. I destroyed one for you, so you don't have to, basically. So the included right angle HDMI cable we ended up using to film and do all the testing and everything, which is what I would recommend using if you don't have a right angle DisplayPort cable. But you can get them on Amazon and stuff for like a couple of bucks if that's really what you want to do. But yeah, just use the HDMI cable that comes with it. Overall, the design and build quality of the Meshlicious is really good. I am going to give this a great big fat recommendation. This is easily one of the best small form factor cases that we've ever used. I'm pretty keen, I want to do a custom loop in here because I think it'd actually be pretty easy to do it. We could pull it off quite easily, but maybe we'll do that later down the line. I'm gonna try and get my hands on a white one of these as well because I wanna build a white one just to see like the difference in aesthetics and whatnot. But again, I highly, highly recommend this case. Now, in the configuration that we've got here with the PCIe Gen 4 riser cable, and I know people are gonna say, hey, you didn't even use a board that has PCIe Gen 4. The reason for that is, this is the only ITX board that I've got available at the moment, and with the other board that I would want to have used, the ASRock X570 ITX TB3, I wouldn't have been able to make this cooler fit, and that's the other reason why I didn't go with that board. But yeah, anyway, in this configuration, I think it's $179 US with this riser cable, which it's getting to that premium end of the scale. However, if you're going for the base version of this case, which I suspect some people might actually do this, $119 US at the time of filming. However, it's only available for pre-order. I'll put a link to their website. I think you can only buy it from their website, which I think links through to Newegg. But yeah, just keep an eye on that. I think it's releasing this month or next month or April. I don't think they're quite sure with the pandemic and everything else going on in the world. I think it's everything's been slightly pushed back a bit, but yeah, I dig it. What do you think, Claire?
It's pretty cute.
It's cute. That's a nice thing to call it. It's pretty badass if you ask me. I really, really like this thing. Again, with something like this, just make sure that you really research the parts that you're going to want to be using. GPU support is a little bit less than I thought it was going to be, which is okay. I mean, you can't have the best of everything. Like a 3090 Founders or whatnot would fit in here, no problem. However, with that pull-through airflow design for those Founders GPUs, I would not recommend using it in this case. You need a regular air cooler for your GPU for a system like this. I think that's basically all I'm gonna talk about with this. What do you guys think about this case? I love it, I think it's awesome. I highly recommend this case, like I already said. The price is okay, the design is pretty good, and yeah, yeah, I can't really find anything that I don't like about this case. I actually enjoyed building with it. It was quick, it was easy to cable manage. It looks a bit messy, but the reality is, at the end of the day, it gets the job done. And the last thing I wanted to add is I hope that they sell additional side panels, like the mesh side panels, because it'd be great just to have this as a giant mesh box. Anyways, guys, if you like the music you heard here, I make all the music. It's available over on our Patreon. If you want to know what all the parts are, there's a PC part picker list down below in the description. And if you want to get early access to videos just like this one, head on over to Floatplane. Wow, I almost messed it up. Once again, thank you so very much for watching. I'm your boy Nick with Gear Seekers. You peek, we seek. And truly, this case is awesome. I like it. Very hard to dislike anything about it. I know people in the comments are going to dislike some things. I like it. I dig it. This is not paid for or anything like that. I genuinely think that this gives the NR200P from Cooler Master a big old run for its money. Thanks for watching.